Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a warm welcome to you for our first session, which is indeed in the visual arts. Imagining the Mughals is the title of our session and conversation. And I think that for any of us who work in the visual arts, the artistic culture of South Asia, the Mughal legacy plays an overwhelming role. And today what we're going to do is really look at how the Mughals have been represented historically and in modern and contemporary art, particularly examining the dialogue between Britain and South Asia and the question of shifting balances of power over these hundreds of years, and in the post-war period, the way in which artists from South Asia have come to Britain, have become effectively British artists, but have arrived with this very large visual heritage. And we have with us three speakers. I'm the moderator, obviously, and the format of the session is that each of the speakers will deliver a presentation of 5 or 6 minutes, in which we'll really have an opportunity to understand what their respective areas of research are, where they stand in terms of this larger discussion. We will then open up in a conversation where we will be able to agree and argue with one another on various points. The speakers we have today are remarkably distinguished and are all very, very central to the theme. We're going to start with Marine. You know, because we have two Marines, one is a Rizvi and one is a Razvi. I get terribly confused. But Marine Chidai Razvi, who has really worked extensively with the Mughal period, the Mughal court, the visual culture of Mughal South Asia, and based at SOAS, but has worked internationally, contributed very extensively to publications. In fact, we're working right now on an exhibition catalog for the Hermitage Museum, which of course has a great collection of Mughal works of art, has worked extensively with Mughal monuments, and looked at as well at hybridity and Western influence in Mughal art. So someone whose work is really central to our discussion today. So Marine, I'd like to invite you to present to us for a few minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Amin. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for coming. So what I wanted to share with you today in terms of the concept of this panel is really to give an idea about where we begin to have the creation of a visual language of power in the Mughal visual arts, because it's really central to then what comes later and to the discussion that we'll be having with the rest of the speakers today. So in the two slides that you see behind me, on the left-hand side, we have a darbar scene, so an audience hall in one of the Mughal courts, in a scene which is taking place in the first quarter of the 17th century. We see the Emperor Jahangir central in the darbar, presenting a turban ornament to his son. And this image I chose, it's really reflective of this entire concept of a visual language of power, which I mentioned previously. We see the ruler in the central space. Your eye goes directly to him. He's the most important person that we are seeing in the scene. He's handing a turban ornament, which is a symbol of authority and power, to his son and his heir apparent, Prince Khurram, who is the future Shah Jahan. We see this taking place in front of the courtly environment. There's many courtiers and attendants who are there watching the scene taking place. We can think of these audience halls and these darbar scenes as very much elements of theater, as places of theatrical presentations, where the entire event is being used for show. Now, because of time, I don't have another image to compare this with, but this is really what we're seeing, the presentation of power and authority. There are symbolic elements of not only political power, but religious power and religious validation. If you look beneath, when I turn around, can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. If you look directly beneath the portrait of Jahangir in the center, on the stone facade that you see, there is a representation of a lion and a bull lying together. Directly above that, there's a globe and two individuals standing with the globe. These are emblems which represent Solomonic ideals of kingship. So the ideal of Solomon being the perfect king in the Old Testament, in the Quran as well. It was an ideal that all Muslim rulers, specifically the Mughals, really aspired to. And by putting this type of imagery in their visual language, in their paintings, elements of it in their architecture as well, they're really making a very bold claim to power and political authority. Contrast that with the image on the right-hand side. So on the right-hand side, we have a darbar scene of Akbar II. He is the penultimate Mughal ruler. You can see automatically there's a difference in the type of scene which is being represented. Although they're both courtly scenes, the one on the left is much more opulent, much more redolent of authority and of power and of luxury and of wealth. And on the right-hand side, those elements are taken away. We still see the ruler enthroned in a later version of the peacock throne, but we're not seeing this taking place within an audience hall. It's taking place outside on a terrace. There are assorted emblems of kingship which are looking back to an earlier period of time. So the halo, which is around Akbar II's head, you see behind around Jahangir's head and Shah Jahan's as well. This was the symbol which comes into Mughal painting during Jahangir's reign as a symbol of divine authority to rule. We see that being perpetuated in later Mughal painting as well. But what I want to highlight on this right-hand portrait as well is the figure standing, the European figure standing. There's not a pointer on this. Just here. That is the British resident to the Mughal court, Charles Metcalfe. He is representing the East India Company and therefore the British government at the Mughal court. We see him very prominently placed, and what we're seeing is a visualization again of power, but here of British power. Because by the time we've come to the 19th century, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit more later on, the British had become exceptionally politically powerful at the Mughal court. And the Mughal emperor is ruling with their sanction. It's really the only reason he still has the position that he has. And so the placement of Charles Metcalfe in this painting is exceptionally symbolically important for not only the place of the British now within the political structure of Mughal South Asia, but also the fact that we have this very complicated relationship between the Mughal ruling elite and the British at this time. One of the other elements which comes about with the increase in British presence and political power in Mughal South Asia is the place of the British individuals themselves who have come into this arena. And we have an element of some individuals like the one on the bottom, Sir David Ochterlony, who is there again as a representative of the British East India Company, very sympathetic to the position that the Mughal emperor has been put in, and that he's essentially a pensioner of the East India Company, but very much loves the culture, and he takes on many trappings of the society. So we see him wearing traditional Indian clothing. He's smoking a hookah, he's sitting on the floor, he's watching a nautch, a dance performance with the musicians. It's a very local scene, but being enacted by and perpetuated by a British resident in this region. And if you look on the upper right-hand side, we have William Fullerton. He was a physician for the East India Company. And he also is one of these individuals who is in the region, and he's adapting himself to the local practices, really enjoying them. And so we have him seated, again, on a terrace, on the floor, so in a local manner of sitting, smoking a hookah. So these practices that were being employed at the Mughal court, which we see on the upper left-hand side, the ruler Muhammad Shah, smoking a hookah in a palatial audience setting, we see these practices, these trappings, this symbolic imagery being now utilized by the British in India as well. And what's interesting about these paintings that I'm showing you is that it is local artists working at the Mughal court who are now also working for British patrons. And this is resulting in a shifting of style of painting as well, where now we have artists who are now creating scenes like the ones on the right, which are being more reflective of a British appreciation in terms of aesthetic, and that changes the actual imagery which is being produced. And then we come to a point where the imagery of the Mughal court fundamentally changes because of the importance that the East India Company and then the British government are having within the political sphere of the Mughal Empire. And so the pairing of images that I've put up here, this is to really exemplify this. On the upper left-hand side, you see an opening page to the Minto album, which was an album of paintings that was produced during, paintings and calligraphy produced during Shah Jahan's reign. And what you see is a double-page portrait which is very clearly representing key concepts of Mughal rulership, the importance of dynasty, symbolic elements which are representing kingship, and the whole notion of the importance of political power. So on the right-hand side, in the center, is the Timurid, the founder of the Timurid dynasty, Timur, who the Mughals trace their lineage to. He's handing his crown to the founder of the Mughal dynasty, Babur, and this is being watched by Babur's son and heir, Humayun. The corresponding page on the left, we have Emperor Akbar handing that same crown to Shah Jahan, while Shah Jahan's father, Jahangir, watches on. So we very clearly see this symbolic passing of political power through a dynastic line being represented. We see the continued use of elements which are denoting kingship, so the fact that each of them have an umbrella over their heads, each of them are sitting on a throne, each of them have their viziers in front of them, and again you're seeing luxurious objects represented, the gold of the thrones, the carpets, etc. So it's all again representing this very potent symbolic power. And if you contrast that with what's on the right-hand side, here we again have Emperor Akbar II on the right and his son Mirza Salim on the left. Now, this is the same ruler who is in this portrait on the right, and you can see the exceptional contrast in style because this set of paintings on the bottom right was produced specifically in a European style. These are portraits on ivory, and these were created in order for Emperor Akbar to request permission from the British government to name his son Mirza Salim as his heir. And this was a request which was made, it was a request which was denied, and Mirza Salim was then not named heir, and it was then Bahadur Shah Zafar, who then becomes the last Mughal ruler. So this is a really poignant set of portraits on the bottom right, because it's showing that despite there's this effort to still portray kingship, we have the ruler sitting with the halo around his head. He's wearing a very elaborate crown, very luxurious clothing, but seated in a European chair, not even a throne now. Both him and his son are sitting in chairs. The format of the portrait is very much like an oil portrait in a photography studio, perhaps, with the drapery, the column, that type of imagery. So it's this hybrid imagery which is being put together to appease the British government, to appease a European source, and ultimately representing a complete loss of political power by the Mughal emperor because the importance that the British have now achieved in South Asia. I think. Okay, the last slide I wanted to share with you is this comparison. On the left-hand side, we have a painting from the reign of Jahangir, and it is a painting which shows, a damaged painting, but it shows an audience scene in which you see one figure who is not Mughal, who's not South Asian. If you look just here, the costume that that individual is wearing is a European costume. You see a doublet, a ruff around his neck and at the wrists. This is a Mughal representation of Sir Thomas Roe, who was the first official European ambassador to the Mughal court, and he was the ambassador from James I from England. And his arrival in South Asia was really integral to the establishment of the British East India Company as a mercantile force, which leads to it becoming a political force, which ultimately leads to the British Raj. And so it's a very key moment in time. This is the only Mughal representation of Roe in the entire body of Mughal painting. He does not feature in Mughal sources. Everything we know about his time at the Mughal court is through his own writings and other writings of Europeans. And so from a Mughal point of view, in terms of the material culture, the visual culture that we have, he wasn't very significant. But from a British standpoint, this was obviously a complete reversal. And on the right-hand side, there is a large-scale painting, which is in St. Stephen's Palace, or St. Stephen's Hall in the Palaces of Westminster, and it is a painting of Roe arriving at Jahangir's court by the artist William Rothenstein, painted in 1925 as a series of paintings in the palaces in Westminster, which were meant to project important points in British history. So this is showing really how integral the acquiring of South Asia was for the British, just for the British. Because what we see is Roe before Jahangir in the court in Ajmer. And what I find really interesting about this particular painting is that you see Roe from the back. You know that it's him, but what you are seeing is the splendor, or the perceived splendor in this case, of the Mughal court. And so it's speaking to the riches which Britain acquired by their acquisition of South Asia. And there's a lot to unpack in there, which we can get to later on.
Marion, thank you very much. I think that the literary reference is particularly important because any of you who have looked at Sir Thomas Roe's accounts of his time in India, well, he really suggests he's rather an intimate companion of Jahangir, and they have these late-night drinking sessions and conversations, and he's really somebody of status. Although he does say repeatedly that there is very little that he can offer the emperor that is going to impress him within this very, very splendid world. There's very little that Britain can actually give. But indeed, the posture of Roe in that portrait is really an ambassador of great quality and great significance, which does not play out in Mughal tradition. We move now to the 20th century, the next presentation by Zara Jumaboy, who is based at the Courtauld Institute of Art, working on modern and contemporary South Asia. And she's had a particularly glowing season, having just curated an exhibition that's opened at Asia Society in New York called The Progressive Revolution, which has grown out of her doctoral work and her own research. So it's an exhibition that's, I think, really taken our subject by storm and brings together particularly early material works of art that have not been seen very, very much before. So she's going to continue the conversation this morning, really looking at how the Mughals continue to concern contemporary artists, British artists, Rashid Ari and Rakib Shah, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. So this is a particularly interesting slide that Marion's chosen to end with, which I didn't really know was going to be there, and it's quite exciting because just as you see the sort of the perception kind of shifts in terms of both actual power of the British and perceived power, you now have we're moving towards the modern and then the contemporary, and I'm doing this through two major sort of South Asian British artists, and one way that we can think of them is in terms of diaspora. And you very much have, with these two artists and the larger rubric of the modern and contemporary they represent within British art history, kind of dealing with the legacy of both the Mughal past as well as Britain's shall I say, well, what the hell, right? We're at the British Library, intrusion into that past, and recreating kind of the sort of the power and the splendor of a Mughal lineage within their work to sort of counterbalance their position within Britain, and I'm talking about these two artists in particular, but particularly Rashid Areen, who we've got up here, where the Mughal is drawn upon because he's a Karachi-born artist who comes to Britain and then redefines himself within the British scene. And even as he is doing that, he's obviously at this stage, within the 70s and 80s, not really accepted. So it's a very different dynamic today, where if you go to Tate Modern, you'll find, or Tate Britain, you'll find Rashid Areen collected. He's got a major retrospective that's happening in the Baltic, in Newcastle at the moment. It's come from Geneva. Before that, it was in Eindhoven. It's going to Moscow. And you have a complete rewriting of Rashid Areen within the British art historical dialogue, and a reclaiming of him and making him into a kind of a British artist of repute. But in the 70s and in the 80s, which is perhaps the period which was most fraught for South Asian diasporic people coming to Britain and trying to establish themselves here, this was completely not the dialogue he found. He found himself very much on the outer edges of the scene, and as you can see from this performance, he wasn't exactly happy with his position, so it's called Packy Bastard, which presumably is something that he would have been called. Also, it's a portrait of an artist as a black person, and it's a performance. So when you're looking at the 1970s and 80s with South Asian artists living in Britain, they tended, and Rashid Areen was on the cutting edge of this movement, to associate themselves with a larger black British art rubric, right? And hence it's a self-definition of being black and taking control. And the other image we have on the right is it's a catalogue for an exhibition called The Other Story. Now, Rashid Areen primarily sees himself as an artist, but most of us think about him as an activist, a sort of an artist activist, also as the curator and game-changing curator in 1989 for an exhibition called The Other Story, which apparently was first presented to the Tate, who didn't want it, and he finally takes it to the Hayward Gallery, and in 1989 they put it on, and it completely changes the scene for South Asian art within Britain. And what happens with this 1989 exhibition, so the catalogue for it that you can see on the right has got Shemza, so it's a group show. And at more or less the same time, Rashid Areen is not just representing black, Asian, and South Asian artists within a British context at a major museum like the Hayward Gallery, but he's also creating a space for pedagogy. So the text is founded more or less at the same time. It used to be called Black Phoenix, but it becomes the text. And so he's very much taking control of this dialogue and saying, we need to take control of that dialogue. And so this is quite an activist period. And because we very much think about Rashid in this kind of rubric, we almost forget that he is an artist, and that's something that is being explored again now with all these this traveling exhibition of his work. And this is where we come back to the Mughals. So this is a work he's done with the Aga Khan Center, and as you can see, it very much references a Mughal tradition. And some of the things that we're looking at here is a merging of East and West, and it's a particular take not just in visuals, but also in an analysis of where as a Pakistani artist living in the West, he fits. What are the things he's drawing on? So if we do a quick sort of deconstruction of the kind of motifs he's using, yes, okay, so we can see their Mughal architectural motifs, they're sort of Islamic friezes, but it also talks very directly to American minimalism, although if you ask Rashid, he gets a little bit annoyed and he goes, I was doing things quite separate from the American minimalists. However, he also sort of calls his work structures, and this is something that you find the kind of American minimalism from the 60s. They looked at their work as constructions, as structures as well. And so there's a riff on that. There's also a riff on the kind of sculptural work that somebody like Anthony Carroll would have been doing within Britain. And so all these kind of conversations, both the Mughal as well as the modern and the contemporary, fuse in this kind of work. The next image we're going to move towards is a completely shifted landscape. So I'm ending with this image. And here we have Rakib Shaw. And Rakib Shaw had a major exhibition in Manchester last year. It was quite a glittering thing. And as you can see from the way in which his images are constructed, that's a painting. They very much use kind of techniques to do with Mughal jewelry, almost. He sort of builds up the picture plane. The reason I wanted this as a contrast, as a different kind of British artist, is because you can see the shifting landscape of even the way in which diasporic South Asian artists speak about themselves within the British narrative, from a Rashid Areen to a Rakib Shaw. Okay, so a few things about Rakib Shaw. He's Kashmiri, but he was born in Calcutta. He grew up in Kashmir, but then I think in 1989, his family moved out of Kashmir when the problem started and moved to Delhi. And then in 1993, he came to Britain, fell in love with the National Gallery, and decided he was enrolling in Central St. Martin's, and decided he was becoming a British artist, but very much drawing on his own family's history as textile traders, as jewelry traders, and the kind of Kashmiri heritage is evident even in the way in which he builds up his pictures, and hence the sort of jewel-like quality. The other thing to remember about Rakib Shaw is that when he enters the British scene, it's a very changed scene. So if Rashid Areen was very much fighting for a space for artists of color, of the black British scene, this is not really where Rakib Shaw will find himself. So Rakib Shaw represents a shift that you see happening in the 90s, early 2000s. And art historians like Neera Ratnam characterize this shift as a shift in identity politics. So it's no longer a kind of activist identity, but it's a much more fluid one, and it's also a much more playful kind of identity. So it's more colorful, it's more ornate, it's more performative, and you can see in this particular Rakib Shaw that he's put himself into the frame. So within the 90s and early 2000s, there are two theorists who are really important within Britain, and then now, of course, that's Stuart Hall and Homi Bhabha. And Homi Bhabha, now very much based in Harvard, and is claimed by American visual culture departments and literature. But at sort of in the 90s, both Hall and Baba were very, very important to reconstructing the identity debate, to make it a much more performative kind of identity. And Hall talks about the third wave of Black British identity. And he says this wave is the most exciting because you see one of the examples of it is self-portraiture. And is performing the self and taking things a lot more playfully, quotationally. So I think this particular painting is a really good is a really good example of that. It's also very hybrid. So you have all the kind of motifs of Kashmir. There's the fort that you see over on the top of the painting. You also see the sort of parakeets. So a very kind of Mughal bejeweled scene, but also very much a nostalgia for a kind of lost Kashmir that you see here. But at the same time, he's very richly garbed in a Japanese kimono, which apparently, according to Rakib Shaw, he paints in this 18th century kimono. I don't quite believe that, but anyway, here you have it. And I'm going to end with looking at what he's being offered. So he's being offered a Mughal rosewater sprinkler. And I'm going to read this out because there's this lovely quote that Rakib Shaw actually has about what that Mughal rosewater sprinkler really represents. So these rosewater sprinklers, Shaw explains, were used during the Mughal period to sprinkle guests during ceremonies and feasts to cool and refresh them. And this is now a quote. Some of the finest examples of these were looted and sent to Russia as ambassadorial gifts, he adds. I don't know who looted them. But their presence in this painting, where the artist is being offered them by well-heeled, grandly garbed beasts, and there are two of them. So there are actually two sprinklers being offered on either side. And they're kind of wolfy beasts. So he says, why am I being offered this beautiful object? What do these creatures represent? And are they art world nasties? So who would these art world nasties actually be? Well, one of the criticisms of Shaw, definitely not in the audience, so I'm fine, is that, you know, his work has become increasingly golden and opulent, and is it a little bit too decorative? But of course, the more decorative it becomes, the better the price is, and also the more likely British institutions are to show them. So quite delicious. So this is what I'm saying. Ironically enough, just as Shaw has finally become a British artist of repute, he reaches once more into the nostalgic Kashmiri Mughal past with this kind of work. So does the rosewater sprinkler symbolize his fear that he's selling out, being seduced by the glory and glitter of being a British superstar artist, or is he just reveling in the celebration and seduction? So yeah, that's it from me for the moment. Lovely.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. I think that the choice of image could not be more apt, given the very classical subject of the adoration of the Magi.
Yeah.
But the complete transformation, and as you say, using this highly virtuosic enamel technique, which is, cornerstone of Mughal jewelry.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very skillful and seamless blending, in a sense, of the two traditions. Our third panelist today is Afra Shemza, who is a contemporary artist working with media and with technology. And so unlike the three of us who have, work on images and text, she's actually a creator of works of art. And she will be giving us a particularly fascinating insight, as she will be talking about her grandfather, the artist Shemza, and his carrying on or perpetuation or hearkening to Mughal visual tradition, and the way in which she engages with his legacy and her own work engages with her further past as well. So really looking at British diasporic artists in the last generation and today.
Thank you. Lovely. Great. So, so I'm going to talk to you a bit about my grandfather's work, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own work. So my grandfather, Anwar Jalal Shemsa, he died before I was born, but I've always had a connection with him through his art. I've grown up surrounded by his paintings in our family homes, and I've often been inspired by them. At the same time that he began his artistic journey, at the same age, I began mine. So what excites me the most about his work was how he stood apart from the Western artists I've studied and managed to fuse Western ideas of abstraction with Eastern influences. So Shemsa was born in Simla, Kashmir, and studied at the Mayo School of Art, Lahore, now the National College of Art, from 1944 to 1947. Okay. There was a slide in between, I think, but I'll just continue from here. So he had achieved widespread recognition in Pakistan with his lyrical, figurative works that drew inspiration from the Mughal and Hindu themes. So the slide showed, I'll just explain it, a sort of more, well, a figurative work, which most of you would never have seen really before of Shemsa's paintings. But it's an early work from 1945, and it very much references those Mughal paintings that you've seen in Marine's presentation earlier. So in Pakistan, he was working with these themes. In 1952, he was a founding member of the Lahore Art Circle. They were a group that were concerned with modernism and abstraction, and it included artists such as Ahmed Pervez and Ali Imam. So in 1956, he moved to London to study at the Slade School of Art. And there, Shemsa's Pakistani artistic achievements weren't recognized. He was very disheartened by one of Ernst Gombrich's lectures, in which the historian dismissed Islamic art as purely functional. And so he subsequently destroyed all of his work that he'd produced in the UK so far. What happened then was a rethinking and a reimagining of himself, his place within the British landscape, within his own identity, and a kind of configuring of the two things together. So what he did was he began an exploration of the modernist abstraction of Klee, Mondrian, and Kandinsky. So later he would combine the simplified formal language of these artists with Islamic architecture and calligraphy to create his own style. Well, as you can see here in this painting called 1 to 9, 1 to 7, it says here, it says, one circle, one square, one problem, one life is not enough to solve it. So this piece here really maps out the visual language that Shemsa is going to be working with for the rest of his life. You can see the circle and the square being the sort of central formation, formal concepts, abstraction, and then the way in which he would then use those to create many different forms. So it's kind of a laying out here. So this piece is actually currently on exhibition at Manchester Art Gallery in the Speech Acts exhibition curated by Hamad Nazar. So, during his time in London, he exhibited alongside many other Commonwealth artists, such as Francis Newton-Souther and Avinash Chandra, and had solo shows at Victor Musgrave's Progressive Gallery 1 and the New Vision Centre in the late 1950s. So, although Shemsa was heavily influenced by Western modernist aesthetics, he created his own unique style, combining these bold abstract forms with Islamic architecture and calligraphy. These he had obviously seen in Lahore, where he spent the first part of his life. The shapes and calligraphy and architecture of the Mughals informed his work greatly, and I think is what makes him really stand out. So the most obvious of this is in his City Wall series, where Shemsa draws on imagery, architecture from his past, and creates these wonderful palaces, archways, and walls. There's a couple of examples here. Ooh.
Pointed at the back.
Here? Yeah, perfect. Where you can really see the architecture really playing a part in Shemsa's artistic narratives. So even in his most more abstract works, you can still see this reference to architecture and the combination of bold abstract forms being fused together to create these almost minarets. Here there are two paintings from his 1960s square composition series, and although they're much less figurative, you can still see the connection between the two series. So I think this gives you a brief idea of my grandfather's life and work. Since he passed away in 1985, my grandmother has been very active in the promotion of his work. And for the last 6 years, I've been managing the estate for my family, working on a whole variety of exciting projects. Far too many to go into right now for this talk, but it's a really fantastic heritage to have, and one which I'm fully invested in. So, with managing all the aspects of the estate and everything there, how can I possibly have time for my own practice? So I'll just tell you a little bit about my work. So in my artistic practice, I've been heavily influenced by my grandfather's work, as I'm lucky enough to have been surrounded with it my whole life. The inspiration for the aesthetic content of my work also, like my grandfather, comes from modernist paintings and sculpture, minimalism, suprematism, and kinetic work. However, for me, I feel in this technological age, there's so many new medias to explore that I wanted to experiment with these in my practice. I feel like as a society, we know we're deeply immersed in image on a day-to-day basis, and we passively receive our visual information without giving it a second thought. So I wanted to set aside a visual language that is sort of aside from this and explores, it secures the audience's attention and asks them to actively take part in my work. So I use traditional sculpting techniques and combine them with the latest technology. In using the most radical technology available to me, I explore how these devices could be used to imagine what the role of art could be in the future. What excites me the most about creating interactive sculpture is that anyone, no matter what their education, age, or background, they can still take something from my work. So here you can see a couple of examples of my work that I've made in the last few years. To the left is a piece that was commissioned by Champagne Louis Roederer. It's called The Heartbeats of Cristal, and it's an interactive sculpture. It has inside it ultrasonic sensors, and depending on where people are around the sculpture or how many people there are, then the piece actually changes colours and pulses in a sort of more dynamic way. So it responds to you, the viewer. And at the bottom right is a piece of mine called The Black Square, which is obviously referencing Malevich's Black Square there. So in my works, you can see a reference to geometric abstraction relating to my grandfather's work, and also geometric abstraction that you see in Islamic architecture. I also work a lot with the idea of infinity through mirrored illusion. So in this piece here, you can see using a two-way mirror, and it creates this infinite reflection and optical illusion. And so this is sort of related as well to this idea of abstraction. So alongside creating new media work, I'm also a researcher exploring how technology can integrate sustainable practice and safeguard our environment for the longevity of our resources. My research in this field has been published in 2 academic papers at the Electronic Visual Arts Conference in London. And in 2016, I co-founded Flux Events, which is an artist peer networking charity. And we host many conversations, much like this, about artists working with new media and the different themes and concepts that they are interested in. So there's lots more coming up over the next few months. And yeah, I look forward to continuing with the panel now. Thank you.
Afra, thank you very much. I'd like to return in the little time we have left to the main heading of our session, which is Imagining the Mughals, and perhaps start with Mehreen. You showed us a few images in which the Mughals project themselves. First in the early period, in the heyday of imperial splendor, with these very obvious symbols of power, and then in the very compromised period of the early 19th century, where you see everything is transformed. The fact that you have Sir Charles Metcalfe right there in the front. In subsequent portraits, you see Mughal power and authority increasingly diminished in the way that the Brits are represented, for example, in processions, birthday processions or coronation processions, where you really see that the British resident occupies a position in the visual line of the painting equivalent to the emperor, just, you know, about a little bit higher in some cases. But in terms of imagining the Mughals, how did others imagine the Mughals? How did the nearest comparable empires, you know, obviously Iran, the Ottoman Empire, and indeed how did European powers of the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries imagine the Mughals? How did the Brits imagine the Mughals at a time when they were thousands of miles away and perhaps rulers that they knew about mainly through text?
It's such an interesting question, because that's really, that last point is really where the whole concept came from. It was the textual sources, for the most part, that were being written by visitors to the Mughal court from both Britain and other European countries, which were then taken back, very quickly published, and in some cases illustrated as well. So there's this very particular narrative which was focused on. And from the 17th century, there's this idea of the Great Mogor, which is one of the terms that was used. And it spoke to and it exemplified this real concept from the 17th century of just sheer luxury at this court in South Asia, which everybody wanted a part of, and it's why we still have the term Mughal today, you know, to be used for people who've achieved a certain status. In terms of physical representations, once we get a little further on in time, we do have a movement of visual material going back and forth between South Asia and areas like Europe, Iran, China even. And so in some cases we have the direct copying of images, and I think our presentation's been taken. No. Just to make it easy for you to see. So, for example, we know that Mughal miniatures arrived in Vienna as one of the places, and they were pasted onto board, and they were placed in an audience chamber in the Schönbrunn Palace. And these are a whole series of Mughal miniatures, mostly from the reign of Shah Jahan onward. And we know, for example, that Rembrandt saw these, because he has a whole series of about 20 images, which he has drawn. It's a drawing from Rembrandt on the left-hand side. He saw these Mughal miniatures, and he was interacting with them at a point in time. And so we have this direct imagery being copied back and forth. And so it's a way of not only the imagery being perpetuated, but the ideas of kingship and power that the Mughals were really representative of. And then the other kind of just way to kind of sum up this is the idea of just the pomp and the luxury, which was still being represented even in the 18th century, at a time when the Mughal power within South Asia is really starting to be diminished. From about 1750, there's a real loss of political power at the Mughal courts. But the idea still is perpetuated. And so you have these fantastical paintings which are produced, of which this is one example, which is really still showing the idea of this incredibly luxurious court and powerful court, which isn't quite in existence anymore.
So it becomes fantasy. It's really the realm of fantasy.
It does become fantasy, absolutely. And then later on, when we get into the latter half of the 18th into the 19th century, any visual imagery which we do start seeing is then representing more of the British power in the region as opposed to the Mughal power.
So you see a sort of infantilizing of the East at that point. You see a complete reversal, yes, in the way in which the East is projected.
Definitely.
And Zara, how does the 20th century artist from South Asia working in Britain grapple with or deal with the rich visual legacy of Mughal painting, Mughal architecture, etc.? To what extent do they really carry this heritage with them?
I think that it's particularly true of Muslim South Asian artists, sort of looking back. But it's also, I think, quite important to remember when you're talking about modern contemporary art that there's all this sort of history as well as art history that has been written in order to marginalize. So there's a kind of baggage where you'd already have to deal with the fact that you're, again, why do I keep saying weirdly politically contentious things? But when you're a second-class citizen, right? So you start on a back foot. And so in a way, the channeling of the Mughal becomes a way of channeling a kind of power and glory and saying, this too was ours. Why, you might have taken from us, but we can put it back, and we can put it back in an art historical sense and in a cultural sense. And it was a way, I think, of claiming legitimacy, but also perhaps a way of rewriting a narrative about the Mughals as having been effeminate, debauched, decadent rulers, and saying, well, actually, even if you look at, somebody like Rashid Areen particularly, and Shemza too, if you look at the sort of scientific developments, if you look at, the things that are usually within a Western art historical discourse written out of non-Western cultural spaces, the more scientific, the more rational. Actually, even if you look at all of those things, the Mughals contributed to it. And hence it's quite important that when a Rashid is doing a redefinition, that definition shouldn't channel the most ultra-decorative elements, but actually, and Shemza does it too, the kind of the scientific legitimacy. And I think that's quite interesting. And it's even more interesting that when someone like a Rakib Shah feels, is a younger generation artist and is quite comfortable with what has happened before, that he no longer feels he needs to be an ultra sort of scientific reference point. It doesn't have to be all about geometric spare abstraction. He can now be as opulent as he wants, and in fact is encouraged to be so.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we're in a very different world. Afra, we were speaking earlier, and you mentioned a little bit about how your grandfather's education here, art education in the UK, in a sense, his inherited values, visual traditions, etc., were dismissed in such a summary way in an art school environment. But at the same time, we have in the 60s and 70s and 80s the growth of a huge scholarship in the UK around Mughal painting and around Mughal works of art. And I'm thinking in particular in 1982 of the big Indian Heritage Show at the V&A, which was an absolutely transformational exhibition, which had at its heart the whole question of hybridity. Mm-hmm. And every single section of that exhibition dealt with the question of the Mughal world and the outside world. Do you have any sense there, Afra, of the impact that these exhibitions had on diasporic artists working in the UK, because they were such an endorsement of their visual heritage, in the same way that that Hussein and Souza went to Delhi to see an exhibition in, is it 47? And that was transformational in the way that they approached their own heritage.
Yeah, that 48 exhibition, obviously I've been thinking about that a lot.
48, sorry.
Yeah, so it's actually an exhibition that starts in 47 at the Royal Academy here, and then it goes to both India and Pakistan, and the naming of the exhibition obviously goes into crisis as well, because now there's a Pakistan to contend with. So they call it the dominions of India and Pakistan. But what really happens is when that travels in a very modified form, again, it's quite a lot of Mughal stuff, quite a lot of Gupta sculpture, and you have that generation of Indian artists who have been looking at the West, the progressive artist group, and they find their own heritage. And I think a similar kind of thing would be happening now, except that I also think it's kind of important to admit that when you have I mean, we're all free nations now, right? We think. So it's a kind of different dynamic, because at some level, you know, the V&A, the British Library, you know, institutions in the West, even to some extent, I guess the Asia Society Museum, when they have exhibitions like this, it also cements and fits into the national dialogues of the places where they're held. So there's a particular reading of Britishness that happens when something happens at the V&A, similar to America, and that's a different dynamic that is introduced. And so I'm always being politically contentious, and I always sort of think, well, why? Why is it happening? What is it that has shifted in the way Britain is willing to acknowledge its own past? And I think that's where the question becomes really, really important. It's a sort of the dealing with the British Empire and its after effects, which are very much with us today. I mean, if you think about the immigration problem, it's not disconnected. And so if artists are dealing with the immigration problem in various different and sort of politically active or less politically active ways, then in some ways these kind of exhibitions have an impact on that.
Agreed completely. I'm afraid that on that important point, we're going to have to wind up because time has already passed. We're almost at 12 o'clock. We've overrun already.
Oh, God.
So thank you very much, all three of you, for participating. I'm sorry we didn't have more chance for conversation, nor indeed an opportunity to engage with the audience, because the subjects are so rich and so meaty and so very relevant today. Thank you very much.